Earlier this week, Puerto Rico announced that its debts were unpayable and setting up the stage for a potentially bruising restructuring battle. With me is Charles Blitzer from Blitzer Consulting, who advises hedge funds, some of which own some Puerto Rican debt and some which are looking at the situation, and Nick Ravitch, who advised New York back in the 70s when the city hit its own fiscal mess. Thank you, both of you, so much for being here today. Nick, if we maybe open up with you. I mean, you are now also advising or helping counseling the Puerto Rican government. They said they can't pay their debts and they probably need a broad-based restructuring that reaches right to the top of the core government debt. I mean, why do you think this is? Why do they need this?
Because they made the same tragic mistake that New York made in the late 60s and early 70s, that Illinois and New Jersey have made, and that is they used the proceeds of borrowings to cover their operating deficits. And that, by definition, is not a sustainable practice. And Puerto Rico's circumstances were more serious than any other jurisdiction. They have $73 billion of debt, 3.5 million people. And it isn't sustainable at a time when the economy has been declining very, very dramatically ever since the major tax subsidy that the U.S. government provided was withdrawn.
I mean, Charlie, do you think that a broad-based restructuring is justifiable in this case?
I think in this case, not only is it not necessary, any attempt to restructure the debt of Puerto Rico other than the debt of its publicly owned corporations is simply not going to succeed, end up in payments arrears, and end up in a very messy court battle, which will make Argentina look like a walk in the park. Puerto Rico has a fiscal problem, it has a liquidity problem, and it needs to address them. And they just published a report giving a roadmap how to do that. Those things are done. There are other things that can be done which will easily avoid the need for a restructuring.
Do you agree with the assumptions in this report?
She focuses quite correctly, and her team, on the debt which the taxpayers and the government owe, and totally separates out the unguaranteed debt which is owned by utilities and other municipal entities, if you will. And she makes a great case for structural reform to promote growth, a great case for a rather modest fiscal adjustment. Even today, the forecast for the deficit for the government this year, not just the narrow government funds, but all of them, is less than 1.5%. This is something, and if they follow the path that was laid out, they will be in virtual balance by next year. So their only financing needs, except for the next few months or the next year, are refinancing amortizations. That shouldn't be a problem to get from the market.
Dick, do you agree with this? Do you think Puerto Rican
I profoundly disagree with everything that was just said. First of all, not only are the corporations unable to meet their obligations as they mature in the future, but by the end of the year, the Commonwealth will have the money to continue to pay the current operating expenses that the government is responsible for. Now, whether they can be adjusted to a degree, of course, is always true. As far as increasing revenue, to increase taxes when it is very clear and articulated well by Ann Kruger that unless you regrow the economy, this is all going to fail. You can't regrow the economy and increase taxes at the same time. They just increased the sales tax to 11.5%. which has contributed to the fact there are now more Puerto Ricans living in Central Florida than are living in New York City. Now, if you restructure, as this distinguished gentleman said, only the corporate debt and not the Commonwealth debt, you are giving an enormous preference to the holders of the Commonwealth debt over the holders of the corporate debt. And the fact of the matter is, to say that they will have market access again is at 9, they borrowed over $2 billion last year at over 9% triple tax exempt. That is not a sustainable rate at which you can borrow money, and they sure are not going to be able to borrow any more at any rate. And the hedge funds that bought up most of that issue last year knew very well the risks they were taking, and a lot of them sold it, a lot of them bought it back in at a very substantial discount, and they're very smart and very honorable people, and they knew the risks they were taking. But it would be a very unfair result for the people in Puerto Rico to end up adjusting the corporate debt and not the Commonwealth debt.
Well, obviously the Commonwealth debt is at least government guaranteed, it's even guaranteed by the Constitution, but what might a restructuring look like? I mean, this is going to be a fantastic tangle to sort of try to
fix. Well, I think it's going to start with some first-rate professionals that the Commonwealth has hired who are going to meet with all the creditors, and there won't be a major law firm or a major investment banking firm that's not involved representing one group of creditors or another. There will be an effort to try to negotiate a result that would leave the operating budget of the Commonwealth in a position to meet its obligations. You know, the single most important thing is that pension fund will be out of money in another year. And in the event that there isn't a restructuring of the debt, the Commonwealth will have to pay close to $1.2 billion a year in benefits to the retirees. And that obligation has the same sanctity as the constitutional obligation to pay debt.
Well, Charlie, I mean, it sounds like the government is trying, at least it's going to establish as the working group to look at, you know, solutions. So far they're only talking about sort of debt extension, but you still think even that is unnecessary?
Not only is it not necessary, it simply won't work. There is no bankruptcy court, there is no compulsion. The Krieger report simply says the pension fund has these problems, but it does not say it will run out in a year. The main issue is they need to implement the report and get themselves bridge financed so that it's seen that they have no budget deficit, and there are many, many cases of countries and self-governing areas which find themselves in this situation, do adjustments, often more painful than what the Kruger report proposes, and very, very quickly regain market access.
But you said that, you know, potentially if they do go over this cliff, that we're facing sort of Argentine-style litigation. I mean, is that what it might look like if they do decide
I
to go
think
this?
it will look even worse than Argentina, because in Argentina, you essentially have only one class of creditors, which is in court. Holders of bonds which were issued in the 90s under a single indenture or a fiscal agency agreement. Here you have maybe 16 categories of debt which the government itself owns, not things they've guaranteed. Some of them have constitutional protections. Other of them have legal protections. Others have other protections. It's a very complex structure. You'll see in courts not only creditors fighting Puerto Rico, but you'll see creditors fighting themselves.
Is it, you're talking about Chapter 9, but they would need to get access to that via some sort of act in Congress. Is that feasible? Or are we actually facing that kind of?
I don't know whether it's politically feasible. I know it is clearly the right tool to have, and if they had it, they might not even have to use it. You know, in New York in 1975, the banks agreed to things that they swore they never agreed to, and the unions agreed to wage freezes and layoffs, because the threat of bankruptcy, of being able to file, gave the people who represented the government, the civil society, the ability to negotiate. So even if they never used it, having the statutory power would aid the very process that I think my friend here is talking about, in which the government sits down with the creditors and tries to negotiate a solution. But to suggest that there's a solution without a very significant haircut to the existing debt, and the creditors know this, in fact, as well, is not possible because the money isn't there. And the sole Bible here is not the Kruger report. There are some very hard facts which have been disclosed about the shortfalls that are coming, and given the demographic and economic data that was in the Kruger report, it's hard to predict that there's going to be increased employment, increased government revenue, and therefore an enhanced ability to meet all of the obligations they've incurred, be they pension benefits or bank loans or bond loans. And in the world that we live in the kind of society we live in, a promise to pay a pension benefit to somebody who worked for you is morally indistinguishable from a promise to pay interest to somebody who lends you money.
Well, we've seen the US courts tend to side with pensioners recently. But I mean, given that looks at the current moment unlikely that they will get access to Chapter 9, they won't have that stick to hold in the background against creditors.
Well, they're starting the negotiation without that stick, that's correct. Yeah. We'll see how far it goes.
But they probably won't have that. We're running out of, I mean, they have now, in effect, I mean, maybe if they implemented some of these reforms, that's a long process, and frankly, they don't have market access now. I mean, certainly after saying the debts are unpayable, I doubt these hedge funds are going to be funding Puerto Rico anytime soon, right?
No, I think that's absolutely incorrect. The hedge funds, which have been willing to, in effect, underwrite a $2.9 billion bond, wrote a letter last week saying, we'd like to sit down, we'll negotiate each and every one of the terms in good faith. I think it's in their interest and it's Puerto Rico's interest to go down that path to get the bridge financing.
But that was last week.
I think that holds now a fortiori, given the threat of default. I want to put some numbers on the table. The level of debt compared with the economy that the Puerto Rican taxpayer is on the hook for, 38%. You can go to Standard & Poor's and read the same number. The ratio of interest payments to revenue for the government is 11%. Read the Krieger report as of now. The average maturity of the government's debt is longer than any countries in the world, about 23 years. No country or self-governing territory in living memory, and probably living memory of my parents, has ever had a payments arrear with these types of numbers. They work out things with creditors, they get bridge financing, restore market access. I get calls every week from potential investors who are interested in Puerto Rico if there's a clear commitment, in effect, to implement the Krieger report. That's worth going down that road first.
But do you think this is possible? I mean, is there a way out?
I'd say the only distinction between what we're saying is that I am saying that, one, the ability to negotiate with all the creditors, and it is not just the holders of bonds and notes, it is also the people who are dependent on the pension obligations that are constitutionally protected. It is the people who are dependent on having essential public services like police and fire. Their interest in this is just as legitimate as the people who lent the money. And the terms and conditions under which the hedge funds are prepared to make additional loans, and I'm sure Charles is right, that those conditions will be part of a process that's already starting. It started yesterday. It started this week. That's why the governor released the Kruger report, and that's why the professionals who the government has retained have embarked on the process of negotiating with the creditors. Now, maybe they will come to an agreement, but there are clear conflicts. You have monoline insurance companies that have insured a lot of this debt, and I'm sure if anybody is going to make a new loan or provide fresh financing, they're going to want some priority in the debt structure, and that affects other debt holders and the bond insurers. And it's a very complicated process. Hopefully it will succeed. My own guess is it will require the additional clout of having the ability to file under the bankruptcy law.
Yeah. Okay, well, it sounds like the only clear-cut winners here are going to be the lawyers. So Dick and Charlie, thank you so much for being here today.
I hope that's not true.
We'll see.